What happens when a ruler believes she can command the element that gives life? If a queen seeks to control the flow of water, does she not also attempt to command the flow of flesh, of decay, even of time itself? And what price must such defiance demand? In the Palace of Brussels, the answer lingers like a curse. The halls are heavy with silence. Servants whisper their fear with eyes lowered. The Empress forbids water. The words are not spoken loudly. They are carried like judgment. Inside her chamber, Isabella Clara Eugenia lies captive within her own body. Daughter of Spain, chosen defender of the Catholic world, sovereign who once bent cities to her will. Her crown once gave her dominion over armies and lands. Yet in her zeal to shield the living from disease, she cast out water itself. She closed the baths, condemned the wells, and ordered her subjects to wash with vinegar and wine. To bathe became sin. To doubt her became treason. Now her body speaks the truth her laws could not silence. Her skin breaks. Wounds fester, pale larvae crawl upon her flesh. The air tastes of vinegar, but rot overwhelms it. Even here, no water dares touch her skin. A jug slips from a servant's hand. It shatters on the marble floor. A red river of sour wine spreads in silence. Incense replaced by stinging fumes. It is the perfect symbol. She ruled to control the flow of life, but the flow escaped her, staining stone with shame. How did the daughter of Spain, who once ruled half of Europe, end her life begging for the very thing she had forbidden? Stay until the end of this story, and subscribe now, as we reveal the baptism of rot and water that consumed an empress. She was born into a world where the sun never set on her father's empire. Yet even in her first breath, Isabella Clara Eugenia was not simply a child. She was expectation made flesh. The courtiers in Madrid bowed to her cradle as if it contained not an infant, but a decree from God. To them, she was the daughter of Philip II, the most powerful monarch in Europe, a man whose gaze could silence entire courts. To her father, she was something more dangerous, a piece in the great game of crowns, a shield he could wield against the chaos of Europe. From the earliest days, Isabella learned what it meant to live in his shadow. When she toddled into the council chamber, scribes smiled. But Philip did not dismiss her. He let her sit by his chair, tiny fingers resting on the arm of the throne, while voices debated war, rebellion, and faith. She was not told fairy tales. She heard dispatches from Flanders, reports from the Indies, and sermons about heresy. Childhood blurred into duty before she knew how to name it. Philip's love was never soft. He did not praise her for beauty or playfulness, but for discipline. When she mastered Latin passages or recited scripture with unwavering voice, his eyes flickered with approval. That was her reward. Not embrace, but recognition. And though she longed at times to be only a daughter, she understood she was being shaped into something larger. By the time she reached womanhood, Isabella's place was decided. The Netherlands bled under revolt, and Spain needed a sovereign who embodied both obedience and strength. One evening, her father leaned close, his voice low but unyielding. "You are my daughter," he told her. "But more than that, you are Spain's shield." The words pressed into her like iron. She knew then that her heart, her desires, even her prayers belonged not to herself, but to the empire. Her marriage to Archduke Albert was less a union of souls than a coronation of duty. As she rode north, away from the burning skies of Castile, she carried not silks but responsibility. Brussels greeted her with fanfare. Citizens craned their necks to glimpse the Infanta of Spain, dressed in modest dignity rather than jewels, a woman who seemed carved from the same marble as the altars she prayed before. Isabella did not shrink from the burden. Side by side with Albert, she presided over councils, met with generals, listened to merchants and priests. Yet those who observed closely saw where the balance truly lay. Albert spoke with confidence, but Isabella carried the gravity of Madrid. She was not a queen by title, but in presence she was sovereign. At night, when ceremonies ended and the courtiers dispersed, she walked the echoing halls of the palace with her rosary in hand. In those quiet steps, she whispered prayers not for herself, but for the land entrusted to her. She asked for strength, for purity, for the power to hold together a realm constantly at war with itself. And yet, in those prayers, a dangerous seed was planted. Isabella believed discipline could bend not only men, but nature. She believed that through devotion and command, even the forces of plague and corruption could be subdued. To her, control was faith, and faith was survival. The Infanta of Spain had become a ruler of flesh and stone, forged by her father's will and by her own hunger for order. But the same conviction that steadied her hand would, in time, lead her toward the darkest decree of her reign. The summer plague struck Brussels with merciless rhythm. Bells tolled morning and night, carrying grief across narrow streets. Markets emptied, shutters closed, and the smell of sickness clung to the air like smoke after battle. Physicians warned that filth bred death, that streets and wounds alike must be washed with water. But when their words reached the palace, Isabella Clara Eugenia listened with suspicion. Reports had long whispered that public baths spread contagion, that wells carried corruption from unseen depths. To Isabella's mind, water was no longer the cure. It was the channel of rot. In the silence of her council chamber, she made her choice. Her decree rang out with solemn certainty. Let no subject seek cleansing in water. The fountains are to be sealed, the baths closed. Purification shall come from vinegar and wine. For water carries disease into the body and the soul. The city obeyed, for who dared defy the Infanta of Spain? Vinegar cellars grew rich overnight. Families scrubbed their children until the sharp liquid left welts on their skin. Wine, once poured in celebration, was spilled over bodies in ritual cleansing. The scent of alcohol rose heavy through the alleys, but it could not mask the truth. Dirt clung deeper than before. Clothes stiffened with sweat. Wounds went unwashed. Lice spread from body to body. Within weeks, the cost became clear. Children weakened under fevers that no sour wash could soothe. Old men died with sores uncleaned, their flesh blackening as families wailed. Physicians shook their heads in silence, fearful of punishment if they contradicted the law. Mothers whispered prayers over vinegar bowls, convinced obedience would shield their homes, only to watch their households collapse one by one. Resentment spread as fast as plague. In the markets, people muttered beneath their breath, "The Empress forbids water. She leaves us to rot." It was spoken in bitterness, yet always in secret, for to doubt her command was to doubt the divine authority she claimed. Inside the palace, Isabella walked with steady grace, veiled and composed, believing herself chosen to bear this burden. To her mind, the suffering was proof of discipline, an offering of flesh that would preserve the soul. She saw obedience, not decay. Every jug of vinegar poured seemed to her a shield raised against death. But outside, faith curdled into despair. Streets once alive with fountains now stank with stagnant waste. Families who had followed her order most faithfully often lost the most, their sores and infections spreading unchecked. And so the whispers hardened into a name that clung to her like a curse carved in stone. The Empress Who Banned Water. It was a law written in fear, carried out in obedience, and remembered in rot. And though Isabella believed she had protected her people, she had in truth bound her fate to the very element she despised, a fate that would one day claim her body in the most merciless of ironies. When Archduke Albert's coffin was lowered into the crypt in 1621, Isabella Clara Eugenia felt the earth shift beneath her feet. For more than 20 years, she had leaned upon him, not only as husband, but as the partner who shared the burden of rule. Now she stood alone in Brussels, draped in black, her crown intact, yet her soul hollow. The palace grew colder without his presence. At meals, the silence was so thick that even the clatter of silverware sounded like intrusion. In council, she sat at the head of the table with the same composure as before. But when decisions had been made and courtiers had gone, she walked alone through echoing corridors, her veil trailing across the stones like a shadow. She clothed herself in the habit of a nun, trading silk for coarse cloth, as if austerity could numb grief. Every morning she moved slowly toward the chapel, rosary beads slipping through her fingers. She whispered prayers for Albert's soul and for the strength to endure her duties. Madrid confirmed her authority. The Netherlands remained hers to govern, and so the widow became once again the sovereign, cloaked not in jewels but in faith. Yet, as she buried herself deeper in prayer, her body began to betray her. At first, she noticed only fatigue, the heaviness in her limbs that fasting could not explain. She dismissed it as mourning, a wound of the heart. But then a swelling appeared on her leg. One evening, as her attendants removed her stockings, they recoiled at a sore no larger than a coin, glistening and raw. Isabella ordered them to fetch vinegar. Convinced that purity burned into the skin could close the wound, she pressed the cloth until it stung, whispering prayers under her breath. The next morning, the sore was worse. The skin around it had darkened, the smell faint but undeniable. She repeated the ritual with vinegar, telling herself she was purifying what the body could not heal, but the wound refused to close. Soon another appeared on her arm, then a cluster on her thigh. Servants began to notice before she did. They hesitated as they laced her gown, shifting their faces away from the odor that lingered in the chamber. Some whispered that the Empress carried the plague within her. Others prayed in silence, crossing themselves before entering her room. Isabella saw their unease yet said nothing. To her, this was trial, a cross placed upon her shoulders. Suffering was not humiliation, but sanctification. Still, the palace itself seemed to withdraw from her presence. Courtiers bowed with stiff politeness but kept their distance. Candles flickered uneasily when she passed, their light bending as if repelled. Her ladies-in-waiting shortened their visits. Pages lingered at doorways rather than step inside. Even the priests who came to hear her confessions averted their faces as they knelt. Isabella held to her faith with greater fervor. She fasted longer, prayed deeper into the night, and reminded herself that Christ too bore wounds upon his flesh. Yet each evening, when she uncovered her sores and found them spreading like dark flowers across her skin, she felt a tremor of fear. In the mirror she saw not sainthood, but decay. The people outside did not know the full truth, but whispers grew sharper. They repeated the old phrase with bitterness, the Empress Who Banned Water. It returned now like a curse, clinging not only to the streets, but to the palace walls themselves. And Isabella, once shield of Spain and sovereign of the Netherlands, sat alone at her table, her body breaking in silence, her prayers rising into a sky that seemed farther away with every passing day. By the late autumn of 1632, Isabella Clara Eugenia's chamber no longer smelled of incense, but of something darker. The sores that had once been hidden beneath her gown now consumed her body. They spread across her legs, her arms, her torso. Wounds that refused to heal no matter how much vinegar and oil were poured upon them. The truth revealed itself one night when Maria de la Cruz, the maid who had served her since youth, bent to change the bedclothes. She lifted the sheets and froze. From the wound on Isabella's thigh, pale maggots spilled in clusters, writhing against the linen. Maria dropped the cloth and cried out, her voice cracking with horror. Isabella lifted her head slowly. She saw the creatures moving across her own flesh. Her lips trembled, but she forced her hand around the rosary. "Do not fear," she whispered, her voice broken. "They are but trials of the body." Maria fell to her knees, tears streaking her face. "Majesty, this is no trial. It is torment." She reached forward as if to brush the insects away, but recoiled when she saw them burrow deeper. She later confessed to another servant that she had felt as though she was looking at a body already in the grave. The next morning, Dr. Jan van der Linden, her chief physician, was summoned. He entered with the air of a man who had already resigned himself to failure. When he peeled back the bandages, the sight made even him stagger. The flesh writhed as if alive, crawling with larvae that fed upon it. He whispered under his breath, "Christ preserve us." Isabella fixed her eyes on him, her face pale but composed. "You will not speak of this," she commanded. "What you see is between God and me." But the physician could not forget. In a letter written years later, he recalled the moment. Her body seemed possessed by another life. He wrote, as though worms had become her subjects, and she their unwilling host. The palace did not remain silent for long. Servants who carried linens whispered of the smell that clung to them even after burning. Guards muttered that the light dimmed each time the door to her chamber was opened, and Maria de la Cruz, though loyal, could not keep her grief from spilling into her prayers. Every night the queen clutched her rosary and whispered that this was penance, that Christ too bore wounds upon his flesh. Yet in the solitude of her chamber, when Maria dared not watch, Isabella wept. She pressed vinegar-soaked rags to her sores, telling herself she was purifying the rot. But when she removed them hours later, the worms only shifted and multiplied. Dr. van der Linden returned often. Though he brought no cure, he recommended stronger fumigations, more incense, harsher spirits to burn the flesh, but never water. To suggest it would have been to challenge the very law she had written. And so he watched in silence as his sovereign was consumed alive. The courtiers outside spoke of it in whispers. They had feared her decree against water, but now they feared her presence itself. The Empress who banned water was becoming the Empress of rot. And still Isabella insisted on dignity. Each morning she ordered Maria to dress her, though the gowns clung to her wounds. Each day she demanded reports of her provinces, though her voice quavered with pain. Power had once been her shield. Now it was only the veil that concealed a body already surrendering to decay. By the spring of 1633, the Palace of Brussels felt more like a crypt than a seat of power. Curtains were drawn to keep out the sun. Incense was burned until the air was thick. Yet nothing could veil the truth. Isabella Clara Eugenia lay broken upon her bed, her flesh alive with worms. Maria de la Cruz, her most loyal maid, wept quietly as she tended to the linens, though no cleansing could drive away the stench of rot. It was then that Dr. Jan van der Linden entered with a new resolve. He had watched helplessly for months as vinegar and oil failed to halt the decay. Now he knelt by the Empress's bedside and spoke in a trembling voice. "Majesty, there is one remedy left. Not cloths, not incense, not wine poured upon the sores. You must be immersed in water. It will be boiled, made pure with vinegar, strong wine, and herbs. Only water can wash away what has taken hold of you." At his words, Isabella froze. Her cracked lips parted, and shame clouded her eyes. "I forbade water," she whispered, her breath thin as parchment. The physician lowered his head. "You forbade corruption. This is not indulgence, but salvation. Let us turn water into fire. Let it burn away the worms. Without it, Majesty, there is nothing left." Maria clutched her mistress's hand, tears spilling down her cheeks. "My lady, please, do not refuse. Let this be your release." For a long moment, the chamber was silent, save for the hiss of candles. Isabella's gaze wandered to the crucifix on the wall. At last she exhaled, a whisper barely audible. "Bring it." The order spread through the palace like thunder. Servants carried great cauldrons, filling them with water drawn from hidden wells. Vinegar and wine were poured in, herbs thrown upon the surface. The mixture boiled until steam filled the halls. A wooden tub was placed in the center of her chamber, its rising vapor sharp and acrid, stinging eyes and throats. Yet beneath it all lingered the unmistakable essence of water, the very element she had once declared forbidden. When all was ready, Maria helped her sovereign rise. Isabella's body shook with weakness, her habit clinging to sores that wept through the cloth. Each step toward the tub felt like a march to the altar. Courtiers stood back, their faces pale, watching in silence as the Empress of Spain confronted her final paradox. She was lowered into the steaming bath. The moment her skin touched the water, she cried out, a sound that rang through the palace corridors. The heat seared her wounds, driving the worms out in a grotesque frenzy. They floated upon the surface, writhing, then sank lifeless into the cloudy liquid. Servants crossed themselves, horrified yet unable to look away. Maria held Isabella's hand through the agony, whispering prayers with each breath. The rosary beads slipped through Isabella's fingers, clattering softly against the side of the tub. Her eyes widened, then softened, her body slackening as though the weight of both empire and flesh had finally been lifted. Dr. van der Linden stood in silence. He had promised salvation, yet knew what he had truly delivered. The bath meant to cleanse had become her shroud. Isabella Clara Eugenia, the Empress who once banned water, died immersed in it, her final breath rising with the steam like a bitter prayer. The worms were gone, but so was she. What remained was only the empty tub, its surface still, carrying the stench of vinegar and death. When Isabella Clara Eugenia's body was lowered into the crypt, Brussels exhaled a weary silence. The bells tolled as they always did, but their sound carried no triumph. It was not the passing of a sovereign who had conquered her age, but of a woman undone by it. The people whispered of the irony. She had forbidden water, yet water had claimed her in the end. They spoke of the worms, of the bath, of the steam that rose like judgment. But beyond the horror lay a deeper truth. Isabella had been raised as a daughter of Spain, shaped to preserve the Catholic order of her father, Philip II. She carried his world like a mantle, a world where discipline was salvation and authority was absolute. But by the time she ruled the Netherlands, that world was already cracking. Revolt spread across provinces. Heresy surged through churches. Plague swept across cities with no respect for edict or faith. The old order, built upon rigid command, strained against forces that could not be controlled. Her decree against water was more than a law. It was the symbol of her struggle to hold back change. In water she saw impurity, danger, rebellion. To ban it was to assert that the sovereign could command not only people, but the elements themselves. Yet water is not a servant. It flows where it will. It seeps through stone, through memory, through time. No crown can dam it forever. Isabella became a victim not only of her own command, but of history itself. She stood between two currents, clinging to the old certainties of faith and discipline, yet confronted by a new world that demanded adaptation, not rigidity. She tried to force the stream of history to bend, and in doing so, she was broken by its weight. Her body carried the parable, denying water to her people. She condemned them to filth. Denying it to herself, she rotted alive. And in the end, her release came only when she was submerged in the very element she had feared. Her death was not only grotesque, but symbolic. It was the drowning of a sovereign who sought to forbid the flow of life itself. Centuries later, her reign is remembered less for treaties or councils than for this haunting paradox. She reminds us that power which refuses to yield to the current will one day be consumed by it. Kings and queens may forbid, decree, and punish. But history moves like water, carving through stone, indifferent to command. Her legacy lingers as a warning. Authority may perfume itself with incense, drape itself in silks, and cloak its weakness in prayer. Yet the truth seeps through. No edict can silence decay, no crown can forbid water, and no sovereign can halt the river of time. So the Empress Who Banned Water became instead its servant. Her last breath carried away in steam. She is remembered not as the shield of Spain, nor as the governor of the Netherlands, but as the woman caught between two worlds, the one she inherited, rigid and absolute, and the one rising beyond her, fluid and ungovernable. If even she, the daughter of the mightiest king of her age, could not bend the current, then what crown can truly escape it? This is why her story still matters. It tells us that every throne stands on shifting ground, every edict is a dam against a tide, and that in the end, history will flow as it must. Stay with us and subscribe as we continue to reveal the rulers who tried to command the current and the ruin that followed when the river of time refused to obey.